Good morning. So my name's Josh, and Carl is with a group down in Guatemala. They are getting to make a bunch of meetings happen with some of the churches that we work with there, as well as they're also going to be painting a couple rooms in the academies that we visit. So if you're someone who prays, we'd really appreciate your prayers for that team as they're doing stuff in Guatemala this week. That would be fantastic. Hey, this morning we're continuing our series we're calling Crave. Have you ever been in a situation where you just felt like you were stuck? And whatever that looks like for you. Just, you ever felt stuck?
Yes.
A week and a half ago, my wife and I were like, we should rearrange the house. And so we did. Have you ever started a project and then halfway through been like, oh, that's a lot more than I thought it was going to be? And we were like, we'll switch the living room and the family room. And so where the TV used to be, it's now in another room. I had 20-something wires running to that spot through the wall, which meant now that I had to do what? Move it and move, yeah. And so most of those wires were in the attic, which this is a good time to be in your attic, right? It's cooler outside. I've got a little, but one wire was underneath my house, and all of the ducting is also underneath my house. And I'm not a dainty human being. And so I went and did it. My brother was up top. I measured it when I was finished just to see how inconsequential that amount of work took. It moved 9 feet 8 inches. Pulled the cord down where it was coming up into the house, moved it to the new spot, drilled a hole up, and put it up into the new room. You with me? Yes. Anyone ever spent a bunch of time underneath their house? Isn't that just the best? Isn't it super fun? And then the ducting makes it. And so I went, I found the cable. It was really easy to find. I grabbed it, pulled it down, came right through, and I thought, okay, I'll just have to move it over there and we'll be done. Turns out there's this beam that runs across the center of my house that makes it impossible to just go straight there. And so I had to go around, and then there was ducting, so I had to go around. At one point, I had done more than 360 degrees. I had gone a full circle trying to get into spot, and I finally got close to where my brother was, because that was where the cord needed to go. And my left arm could not touch the ground because there was a beam here, and my right arm could not touch the ground over here because there was ducting. And so I sat like this on my back with a drill in my hands. I gave my brother a small drill bit to drill down so I could figure out where I needed to drill up. You with me? But I didn't want to, if you had to put multiple holes in the ground, I didn't want there to be really big holes, right? You with me? So I gave him this tiniest drill bit ever, which was really foolish, because when you're underneath the house like this, sweating, it's real hard to find like less than an 1/8 inch size drill bit. And so I'm sitting there looking, and Ben's like, it's in spot. No, it's not. Yes, it is. No, Ben, I'm down here. There's nothing. And I took my phone because like I wanted to be able to talk to my brother. I was yelling a lot. We didn't need any phone. He was right there, right? I'm yelling. I'm like, come on. And I have a manageable fear of claustrophobia. So like I can kind of talk myself through it, but I don't like being, and I started to panic. And I couldn't do anything this way, but I could crush the ducting this way. And so I'm trying real hard not to freak out. Have you ever been in the moment like that where you're stuck? What do you want to do in that moment? Just get out of there, right? Yeah, but where do you go? Because I'm like, And finally, I see, he is like, I'll do another hole. He drills down. I was like, there it is. I see it. I was like, all right, pull it out. And I turn the drill around so that I can start to drill my hole up. And I look at the battery indicator light. 1 bar. And I'm thinking, this is gonna, like, I don't care what it takes, this is happening. And I drilled it and punched it through and got the cord through. It took me almost 30 minutes to get all the way back out. And I had ironically, my brother, the crawl space, like the way to get down there is in his closet. And the whole time I'm doing this, he's like, dude, can we hurry it up? I'm like, dude, you're in the heated upstairs. I'm down here in the dirt. I'm prone to, I can't even sit up at any point. And I get to the point where I'm like, hey, you got to meet me in your room so I can hand you tools and get out. And I'm handing him stuff. And I see him. I make like, and he goes, finally. So his funeral's next week. We'd love it if you could join us. It'd be great. No. He's really great, actually. He's a good sport about all the stuff I've made him do. But have you ever felt like this and just thought, I got to get out of here? I want to take a look today at a guy in the Bible who I think at different points felt that way. I think he felt at different points that he got himself into situations where no matter what he did, it only made it worse. Like every attempt to try and solve the problem, there weren't any good ones. He was darned if he didn't, and he was darned if he did. Like he was stuck. And I want to kind of take a look at what he does, because this is the guy of whom the Bible speaks. He chased after God's heart. He didn't always have a heart that was exactly like God's, but the desire of his heart. Matter of fact, the craving, which is why we called it crave, which crave means to long for or want greatly or desire, a really strong desire. His strong desire of his heart was for it to be like God's heart. And I think he does a couple things that are really valuable. At the end of his mess, the thing that he created and that he was in, where he was stuck and didn't know what to do, he writes this: "Praise be to the Lord my rock, who trains my hands for war and my fingers for battle. He's a loving God and my fortress, a stronghold and deliverer, shield in whom I take refuge. He subdues people under me. I sing a new song to you, my God. On a 10-stringed lyre I make music to you. To the one who gives victory to kings and who delivers his servant David. From the deadly sword deliver me, rescue me from the hands of these people whose right hands are deceitful. Then our sons in their youth will be like well-nurtured plants, and our daughters will be like pillars carved to adorn a palace." Here's my question. He wrote that at the end of the mess he was stuck in. Do you think it resolved well or poorly? What do you think? You think it went well? You think it went poorly? Let's dive in. And one of the things I think David does exceptionally well in the midst of pretty much every step along the way is he asks this question that he wants to know, and he figures out what God's perspective is on the mess that he's in and on who he is. And I want to say something really important up front that a friend told me this week as I was kind of working on this message. He said it's important to remember at times that though we make messes from God's perspective, that does not make us a mess. That though we make messes, from God's perspective, he understands we make messes. That doesn't surprise him. But he doesn't think of us as a mess because of it. And oftentimes, if I'm honest, I see the mess that I created and begin to think, well, then I'm a mess too. Have you ever thought that? And I just don't think God's that way. And David does a great job of getting God's perspective on things, which really changes how he responds to the situations. And I think that's super important. The other thing I think that's important is that David does three things in the story. Here's how he does it. He cries out for help. He reminds himself of how great God is. And eventually he praises God for deliverance. Now here's the story. And I got to tell you, this is like a 6-chapter story. So I'm just going to kind of jump through the story and hit different verses along the way. Last week we talked about what's probably, it may not just be David's greatest triumph. He took on this giant named Goliath. It may just be the greatest triumph in the Bible. I mean, it's certainly a great underdog story, right? Like, young man kills giant. And that was David in that moment does a great job of craving God anyway, which sometimes it's really hard when things are good to still desire God, right? Like we start to think we can do it ourselves. But we're going to look at the complete opposite. We're going to look at what's David's greatest failure and specifically what it sets in motion. So David, at one point, he's this warrior king. He's the king, and at the time when people would normally go off for war and where kings would lead their armies into battle, David stays home. He's not where he's supposed to be, which I'm convinced most of our mistakes, most of our messes start because we're not doing what we should be. So David stays, he's on his rooftop, he sees this beautiful woman, and he desires her. And so he has her brought to him, and he gets her pregnant. And he tries to cover it up. He brings her husband, who's this incredible warrior, back from battle to try and get them to sleep together. So be like, "Oh, look, you're pregnant. What do you know?" And it was only a 7-month pregnancy. Trying to cover it up. And the husband's this super honorable guy who won't, he's basically none of the other men are with their wives. I'm not going to do it either. No. And so David then kills him. Or has him killed. He doesn't kill him. He orders that he be killed. And this way that makes it look like battle did it, but really it was David. And then from public perception, David steps in a great way for one of his warriors. He actually takes the warrior's wife into his home and cares for her as if he was her. Now, what nobody knows is she's pregnant with David's child. And eventually, God sends this guy named Nathan who convicts David. It's like, "Hey, here's this story." And David buys into it. And it's like, "Yeah, you're the guy." And the baby ends up dying, actually. But they get pregnant and have another baby, and that's the whole other thing. So that's the mess, right? David makes that mess. The very next chapter, it shifts to another part of David's family. And so David there's 3 people you need to know. They're all children of David. There's Absalom. And Absalom has a sister named Tamar. And then from a different mother, David has another son named Amnon, which I think makes them half siblings, right? Or step siblings? Half, yeah. So half siblings. And so there's Absalom, Tamar, and then over here you have Amnon. You with me? Okay, so Amnon really had strong feelings for Tamar. But this isn't kosher, right? It's illegal. But he gets to this point where he can't fight the feelings anymore. And so he creates this really elaborate plan. And he fakes sickness. And David comes to visit his sick son, Amnon, who's faking it. And Amnon says, man, David says, is there anything I can do for you? If you could send Tamar to take care of me, that would be great. And David's like, sure. Sends Tamar in. And when Tamar shows up, Amnon commands everyone else out of the room and tells Tamar, I'm really ill. Come to my bed and feed me. And when she gets close enough, he grabs her. And she goes, no, we don't do this. This is not right. She clearly doesn't reciprocate his feelings. But he overpowers her and takes advantage of her. What would you do if you had a daughter that was taken advantage of in this way? What would your response be? Yeah, somewhat illegal, right? Nobody needs to voice this stuff because we're filming this service. I don't want anyone to be able to look back on this eventually and be like, well, it turns out. But we would respond pretty strongly, wouldn't you agree? Yes. David hears about everything that's happened to his daughter, and David heard everything and he was furious. That checks out, right? Yeah. Right. Look what he does next. Nothing. What's up with that? It goes on to talk about Absalom, who never says a word to Amnon. Absalom is the brother of Tamar, right? Either good or bad, but he hates Amnon because he disgraced his sister Tamar. David, meanwhile, other than being furious, does nothing. Why? We don't know. The law actually commanded more. He should have done more, but he doesn't. My only guess is this, because David knew what most of the others didn't, that in good conscience, he couldn't go and convict his son for a sexual crime when he himself had done some sexual stuff that wasn't good, right? He took another man's wife and then had him killed, and so I could be wrong. We don't know. The Bible doesn't say, but there's a part of me that thinks that's what it is. Absalom, meanwhile, plots for 2 years. And 2 years later, having not said a word to Amnon up till that point, he organizes this hunting party. He's like, hey, Dad, King David, come with us on this party. We're gonna go hunting. And David's like, nah, it's not good for us to all be together, because if someone were to attack us and we all died, there'd be nobody left around the. So just, I'm not gonna go. And he says, well, what if send Amnon? And David's like, okay. And Absalom, unbeknownst to anybody, has told all his servants, hey, when we're out hunting in the evenings, when everyone's, and it says high in spirits, which I love how politically correct the Bible can be sometimes, right? When he's high in spirits, I think it's high on spirits, though, if I can throw that out there. But when he's high on spirits, kill him. And they do. And Absalom, in some way, does what David should have, right? He gets justice. Now, maybe it's not the best way. Maybe it's not the right way. They didn't take him to court. But he acts on behalf of his sister. Something David just seemed to drop the ball in. And because of this, though, Absalom flees for his life, because murder is it's kind of hard to it's just murder. We all make mistakes. But that's not really something we say, right? Murder is kind of a big deal. So he flees to this other city, and he's there for 3 years. And after 3 years, David's general named Joab, who he's going to become important later. So remember Joab. He's a bad dude. He's like, look, he's your son. Come on, it's been 3 years. Bring him back. And there's this whole story that happens, but basically David ends up going, okay, you're right, and brings Absalom back after 3 years, but refuses to speak to him. And so one day, Absalom's like, look, I got to talk to my dad. And David refuses to even let him in the palace or whatever. And so Absalom then goes to Joab, the general. Is like, hey, can you let me talk to my dad? And Joab doesn't respond, which I don't know how that looked back then. Nowadays, if someone sends you something you don't want to do, it's just delete the email, oh, I didn't get it, or didn't get the text, or oh, something must be wrong with my phone, or new number, right? I don't know what that looked like back then. I don't know how you missed something, but regardless, they did. And so Absalom got sick of being them avoiding him, and so Absalom sets all of Joab's fields on fire. This is not the point at all of what I want to say today, but I think it's just a good life lesson. If you live near a general, like a warrior, don't ever set his fields on fire, ever, at any point, for any reason, ever. Right? Does that seem like to check out? Well, Absalom does it. It doesn't work. Of course, Joab's angry at him. And eventually, Absalom kind of accepts that this is how life's going to be. And what's really interesting is in this moment, we kind of get a snapshot into David's inner thought life or prayer life. And it's at this point, in the midst of everything that has gone on, with his son murdering Amnon and then being banished from the city and then eventually being allowed in, but having a very strained relationship, that David actually cries out for help. And I think this is the first, if you feel like you're stuck at points in life, this is like the best first step. It's with addiction, this is the actual first step, to admit that you can't do it alone and that you need help. And we think for addiction, like, of course you say that. This is true for all of us. Like in the messes that we make, sometimes we just need to be honest and say, I can't fix it alone, I need help. And David cries out to God for help. He says, answer me when I call out to you, my righteous God. Give me relief from my distress. Have mercy on me. Hear my prayer. How long will people turn my glory into shame? How long will you love delusions and seek false gods? Know that the Lord set his faithful servant, David, for himself. The Lord hears when I call to him. To me, David's like, God, you got to hear me. This is bad. I don't know what to do, but it's not going well. You got to help me fix this. I don't know what to do. My son has killed my other son. I didn't step up and do my job. I dropped the ball too. Like, help me out with it. And he's wise enough to know that he can't do it himself, and he cries out to God. And if you're today here and you're like, man, I feel stuck. I'm in this position, right? But not just physically, like in your life. Man, a first great step is to tell God, I need help. I can't do it alone. And also, other people. A lot of times, when it comes to fixing my own messes, I am so close to the mess, I can't see anything else. You know what I mean? And that is dangerous. And so crying out to God for help, crying out to others for help, they can contribute things that I just can't even see. Well, Absalom, having accepted his new spot in life, comes up with this really nifty plan. He decides he's going to stand, well, I'll show you. Basically, Absalom would get up early in the morning and stand on the side of the road leading to the city gate. Whenever anyone came with a complaint to be placed before the king for a decision, Absalom would say, what town are you from? And he would say, well, I'm from one of the tribes of Israel, which was a big deal because those are the people that David was king of and was trying to represent. And then Absalom would say to that person, look, your claims are valid and proper. You've been taken advantage of. You've been wronged. You deserve this or that or the other, but there's no one here from the king to listen to you. And then he says this, but imagine if I was the one that would judge. Then I would make sure that everyone who came here would get justice. He is telling people what they want to hear. As if this guy is somehow fit to be a judge, right? Like he's like a great law holder, like a law-abiding citizen, right? He just murdered his brother, half-brother, but other than that, he's a good guy. But he's saying all these things, and it gets to the point that the Bible says, so he stole the hearts of the people of Israel. And one day he makes up this excuse to go to this place called Hebron, and David's like, sure, go ahead. And nobody knows. Absalom has arranged for 200 leaders from the nation of Israel to be there. And when he gets there, they're like, hey, what are we doing here? He's like, here's the deal. David shouldn't be king anymore. I should be king. Let's go kick him out of Jerusalem. And they go, okay. I asked my dad yesterday on the phone just because I wanted to know what it was like. Dad, if you were king, he liked that part, and I came and pulled off a military coup against you, how would you feel? And he said, well, I'd be pretty disappointed. And I thought, that's all? And he said, well, I guess I'd be very disappointed. So I'm now planning a coup. No, this is your son, and he's coming to kick you out. And at one point, David actually gets warning. A messenger comes to David and says, the hearts of the people of Israel are with who? David has lost control of the nation. You want to talk about a mess? That's a big deal, right? And David says to his officials, come, we must what? Remember this moment when you're here and you're stuck and you're not sure what do you want? You just want to get out. What does David do? He just takes off. Let's get out of here. This is bad. This isn't going to end well. Let's go. And so they flee. They take off. And he says we must leave immediately and move quickly, or otherwise he's going to overtake us and bring ruin on us and the whole city. And David takes off running. And so let me ask you a question. And I want you to think about it because I'm going to ask you your answer in a minute. On the one hand, Absalom's going to be a terrible king. He's really pretty much only interested in what's best for him. So a narcissist being king is not great. Would you agree? So on one hand, you have hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of Israelites that will suffer because of a lousy King Absalom. And then on the other hand, you have the only other option is to end this or kill your son. I'm not going to tell me in a second. I want to hear your answer. But for now, be thinking, which is the better answer? And recognize right now, it's easy to say, well, just kill the one guy. Like, better for one to die than a whole bunch. But imagine if it was your child or your spouse or your significant other. And think about it for a second. I want to get your answer in a minute. David is stuck in this situation where his options are either to neglect his duty to the nation of Israel or to neglect his duty to his son by murdering him. Those are his options. Neither one's that great. And in this moment, David does something that I think is fantastic. He reminds himself of how great God is. David says this, "Truly you, God, are my rock and my salvation. You're my fortress. I will not be shaken. My salvation and my honor depend on God. He's my mighty rock and my refuge." Then he says this to the people that are with him as they are running away for their lives. Trust in God at all times. Pour out your hearts to him. God is our refuge. Those are hard words to say in that moment, wouldn't you agree? You're on the run for your life. Your son's kicked you out of your position. You haven't done a good job being dad. You haven't really done a good job being king, and now you're paying for it. And in this moment, you say, yeah, let me remind myself that God is the one that will take care of us. God is big enough that to God, this mess isn't that big of a deal. And I love that he does this because he gives himself something really, really important. He reminds himself how great God is, and when you remind yourself how great God is, I think you start to see your problems differently. I think sometimes I forget that God's pretty, like, he can take care of some big stuff. Yeah. So what I did is I went, this is not very much like me, but I went to science to try and show this. And these may be things you know, and that's okay. I think they just do a good job of illustrating how big God is. So the first one is this. Does anyone know the name of the largest star that we know of? So it turns out the sun's not actually that big. There is something called Canis Majoris. There's the sun. Hello. That's Canis Majoris. Yeah. So somebody did the math. I have no idea why. But they figured out that you could fit 2,759,460,000,000,000 Earths in that big star. You know the best, so like I've never heard of a number that big. The only number that I even know is close to that big is the national debt, and even it's not quite there yet, right? But not only that, this star will never probably, I mean, at least at this point, we'll never get to go like fly there and see it. We can see it from afar with telescopes and zooming in, but it's never going to be like, hey, you want to go see Canis Majoris? Yeah, let's do it. So here's my question: why did God make that? And I don't have the answer, but I have a guess. Because it looks pretty in the sky. What if God made that just to make the sky look pretty? And then he took all of the sky and the rock that we're on and everything and thought, let's send it hurtling through space constantly. And I think of that, and I think of the messes I find myself in and think, I guess God could probably take care of that mess. And then not only is God the God of incredibly huge, bigger than we can comprehend, and this is just the biggest we know, there's probably bigger out there. Not only is he's also the God of incredible detail. These are supposed to be red blood cells. They look kind of weird. They look like weird gummies. But red blood cells are what carry oxygenated blood around your body. In one drop of human blood, does anyone want to take a guess as to how many red blood cells there are? And again, I don't know who counted this, because I don't even know how you count this, but supposedly there are 5 million red blood cells in one drop. How do you put 5 million of anything in one drop? And there's not just red blood cells, because your blood also has platelets, which there's 500,000 of those in a drop, and 7,000 white blood cells. So if you were to take a teaspoon of your blood, which we have multiple pints, we probably even have closer, I think, to about 2 liters. But if you were to take a teaspoon, or 120 drops, you would have 600 million red blood cells that all constantly are at work in your body, bringing oxygen-rich blood to different parts of your body, and you never blink an eye. And they die, and your body replenishes them. It ships platelets to places where there's disease or infection. White blood cells show up to help things stop bleeding. I mean, the body is incredible, and God made all this in one drop. And then he filled you with liters of it. And I look at that and think, you know, God, I made a pretty big mess, but I guess you're probably big enough to take care of some stuff. Wouldn't you agree? But sometimes, guys, I get so locked into my mess that all I can see is the mess. And I know it's bigger than me. And I get lost in it. I just get so locked into it, I can't see anything around me. And what David does in this moment, and probably the biggest pickle I can imagine, where it's like, save the nation or save your son, but you don't get to do both. David cries out and reminds himself just how big God is. He's already asked God for help. Now he's reminding himself how big God is. And I think there's something powerful that comes with that reminder. I actually asked a therapist this week. I was like, hey, if someone came to you in life and said, man, I just feel like I'm stuck, what would you advise them to do? And he told me two things, and one of them was really surprising. I did not expect this answer. The first thing he said is this. He said, I would ask them where their self-compassion was. I thought, what? He said, well, yeah. We're so taught in this society to beat ourselves up, to be really critical of ourselves, to like, hey, you dropped the ball, you got to fix it, you got to make it right. He said, but oftentimes that doesn't make anything better. And he said, I'm not saying you shouldn't own it. You should be honest. Yep, I made that mess. And this is where he said, but that doesn't make me a mess. Matter of fact, there's some difference. And God views me as still the one that he created and loves, even though I make messes. And then the second thing he said is this. He said that the two things that help us get unstuck are perspective and time. That we need new perspective and that time has to pass. Time passing we don't really have much control over, right? Unfortunately. Sometimes I wish I could make it slow down. Other times I wish I could kind of pick it up a little bit. You know what I mean? But this perspective one, I do have control over that. And one of the things that David does, I don't even know if he knew he was doing it, but the more he reminds himself of how big God is and what God's done and what God's capable of, I think the easier it gets for David to be able to like have a new perspective. He stops seeing things from his own perspective in the midst of the mess. I think he starts to see things from God's perspective. Which is why I think it's so important to be reminding ourselves how big God is. And yet, if I'm honest, in the midst of my messes, sometimes I'm good about crying out to God for help, but rarely do I remind myself how big God is. Does that make sense? And yet, so often I don't do it. Towards the end of this, David writes this. He says, why, my soul, are you downcast? Can I answer this? Because your son just kicked you out of the kingdom, and you now have two options, to save Israel or save your son, but it's hard to do both. A while ago I asked you, which one would you prefer? What would you do? Would you save your son? Or would you save the nation? Oh, come on, I gave you time to think. Save the son? So for me, it was like, yeah, but I would save the nation. I'd like to think I'd save the nation. I probably wouldn't. I'm not a dad, so I don't really get to make this decision, but there's a part of me that would like to think that I would save the masses over one, but I don't know. And can I be honest? I don't know that there is a right answer. Either way, you lose, right? David's in a situation where there is no win. Either way, it costs him. See, here's the thing. I think there's what we know and I think there's what we believe, and they're not the same. Like, I know God is big enough to handle my problems. But in the day-to-day, moment-by-moment stuff, oftentimes I don't really believe it. You ever done that? Like, I know God could do this, but I don't really think he will. Like, I know that God could fix this, but I don't think... And I think the more we remind ourselves of how big God is, the more we start to believe that God can do it. So here's how the story wraps up. It's kind of a huge mess, right? And so what happens is David sends his army to go and try and liberate and kick Absalom and their whole group out. David doesn't go. It's one of two times in the Bible that there's a war and David decides to stay back. The first time was with the woman and the second time is now. And David has this talk with his general and a couple other guys before they go. He says this. He commands Joab, the general, and two other guys, be gentle with the young man Absalom for my sake. Is any part of war gentle? But he tells them, hey guys, if we could just be gentle, just a little, be good, right? And so be gentle with the young man for my sake. So here is how the general interpreted gentle. There's this point where this guy, one of David's men, is out and happens to see Absalom, comes back to Joab and reports this. Now Absalom happened to meet David's men. He goes back and he says, hey, so Absalom was riding his mule, and as a mule went under some thick branches of a large tree, Absalom's hair got caught in that tree, and he was left hanging in midair while the goat just kept going. In terms of like most embarrassing battlefield incident, this has to be near the top, right? Can I tell you what I love most about this? No one helps him. Like if you saw your buddy stuck in a tree by their hair. Wouldn't you help them?
Take a picture.
Okay, I'm not going into battle with any of you guys. There is no way. Of course you would. And this is the leader. And he's just there. And I don't know what, probably exhausted like an option and then got tired of that and tried something else and that didn't work and tried something else. Joab hears about this, pays Absalom a visit. Now remember, prior to this, Absalom torched a certain person, Joab's fields, and then later kicked them all out of the kingdom and threatened all their lives. But David had said, be gentle. So here's gentle. Joab takes 3 javelins in hand and plunges them into Absalom's heart. That's not the worst part. The next line is, while Absalom was still what? I think my life hope is that if I ever die by 3 javelin, that the first one does it. Or at least the second one. But 3? So then what happens? 10 of the armor bearers surround him, strike him, and kill him. That was the gentle version. Joab's a bad dude. When news reaches David, he's understandably heartbroken. He's shaken. Goes up to the room over the gateway and weeps. Oh, my son Absalom, if only I had died instead of you, oh, my son Absalom. You understand his brokenheartedness? Yeah, he lost either way, right? I think Joab tried to do for David what he knew David couldn't do for himself. And it is after this that David sits down and gives us a glimpse into what he's thinking and what he's praying when he says, praise be to the Lord my rock, who trains my hands for war and my fingers for battle. He's a loving God in my fortress, my stronghold and deliverer, my shield in whom I take refuge. He subdues people under me. I will sing a new song to you, my God. On a 10-stringed lyre, I'll make music to the one who gives victory to kings and who, notice this, delivers his servant David. Notice he doesn't call himself a king. Delivers his servant David. Rescue me from the hands of foreigners. From the deadly sword deliver me. Rescue me from the hands of foreigners whose mouths are full of lies, right? Fans are deceitful. Then our sons in their youth will be like well-nurtured plants, and our daughters will be like pillars carved to adorn a palace. I love that at the end, David is somehow able to praise God for delivering him, even though I don't even know if I would call what happened deliverance, because you still lost your son. One of the things I think, I'm okay at crying out for help to God when I need it. When I'm stuck, when I make a mess, eventually I get to this point typically where I realize it's bigger than me and I ask God for help. I almost never remind myself in the midst of trouble how big God is. I almost never remind myself that God's probably got this. And because of it, because I don't do that second step, I don't take the time to get God's perspective, oftentimes at the end of it, I'm left going, that's not what I wanted. Really, God? This is your fix? This isn't what I was hoping for. And I think when we don't take that second step, when we don't remind ourselves how big God is, start to see things from God's perspective, we're often, at least for me, I'm often dissatisfied with the way things go. I think perspective is bigger than we talk about. I think it's really no surprise that one of the main ways to get unstuck is to get new perspective. I have a video I want to show you that's all about perspective, but I need to make a confession. I've actually shown this video once before, like a couple months ago, but only to first service. So if you've seen it, please don't say anything. For the rest of you, as you're watching this, do me a favor. This guy's a speed painter, which I didn't even know that was a skill. I feel like if someone came to me for a job interview, I was like, what are you good at? Well, on my resume it says I'm a speed painter. No one cares, right? But this guy's a speed painter. In 90 seconds, he's going to make a painting. See if you can figure out what it is before he finishes.
I'm a speed painter, and I'm going to do a painting in a minute and a half or less.
Okay. All right, here we go. Let's hear it for D. Weststream.
Are they good? Yeah, somebody
All right, do you have 1 minute left? Here we go.
What do you think it is?
I
Can't tell what it is.
don't know.
I'm confused.
can figure this out.
I honestly have no clue. My job is not a clue.
I don't think you need much time.
No.
It looks like a pear.
A potato.
A potato.
All right, it's coming down to the wire. 15 seconds, D.
A pear.
Come on. Give
Go,
us a
D.
five.
Westry. Come
Give
on,
us
Westry. Come on.
3, 2, 1. Let's hear it for D. Westry.
Okay, and
There we go.
They're on their feet, D. They love it.
Anybody else start to like feel for the guy towards the end? Like, and she keeps like 1 minute, 45, 30, 10, 15 seconds. And anybody else like start like, dude, you know this is nationally televised, right? She couldn't have done a 2-minute painting? And then did anybody else have that immediately like, that embarrassment for the guy almost immediately replaced with like awe? Like audibly like, oh. I think when we remind ourselves of how big God is, we exchange embarrassment for awe. David did 3 things. He did them really well. He cries out for help in trouble. He reminds himself of how great God is. And then when it all ends up being done, he praises God for the deliverance, even though I don't think it's how David hoped it would be finished, right? I have to think David hoped that there was some scenario where Absalom's army could get kicked out, but Absalom would not, in fact, die. Right? That's like the best case scenario in my mind. And yet for David, it doesn't work out that way, and still he's able to praise God. So here's my question. You don't have to be in trouble to practice these 3. Which of these 3 this week do you need to work on? Which of these 3 this week do you need to start admitting maybe that there's an area of your life right now that you need help in? That you can't do it alone? Which, we don't like to say that, but we all know that we do. We all know that we can't do life alone, that we need other people, and we need, sometimes maybe life even shouts out that like we need help from others and God. Maybe that's where you're at this week. Maybe for you, you need to remind yourself this week of just how big God is. And you can do that by looking around, seeing what God made and or you can remind yourself what God's done. Sometimes one of the most powerful things that you can do when you feel stuck and you feel like you've made a mess you can't fix is to remind yourself how God's gotten you out of stuff in the past, or how God has been there with you in the past, because he doesn't always promise to fix it, but he always promises to be there with us. Or maybe things in life right now are okay or good, and maybe it's time to take a second and stop thinking that we did it ourselves. And maybe tell God, thank you, because I didn't think it was going to work out this way. Thank you, God, because it could have gone a lot of other ways. Which of these 3 do you need to work on this week? Because I'm convinced these are the actions, these are the habits of someone whose heart desires God's heart, desires to be like God's heart. So this week I would encourage you, maybe try one of these on. Maybe write it on your mirror, put it on your cell phone, or do something that reminds you this week to remember that maybe it's time to cry out to God for help. Maybe it's time to remember what God's done, or maybe it's time to just say thanks.